Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event for the Unbound Book Festival. My name is Alex George, and I am the director of Unbound. Tonight's discussion is our final event recognizing the Missouri Bicentennial, and we are thrilled to welcome two of the state's most clear-eyed and astute chroniclers to discuss what we are calling the state of things. As you may know, the festival has always been completely free to attend, whether in person or online, and this wouldn't be possible without the generosity of hundreds of people who have supported us financially over the years. If you go to the website, which is unboundbookfestival.com, you'll see a list of everybody who has given over the past 2 years. It's a very long list, and we are very grateful. There is also, should you be so minded, a quite large donate button, and we would certainly be grateful for your support. The festival is a registered nonprofit and entirely volunteer run, so every dollar that we receive goes directly to putting on these events. Support comes too from the City of Columbia, specifically the Office of Cultural Affairs and the Convention and Visitors Bureau. A full list of our sponsors and supporters is available on the website. Particular thanks this evening goes to the Kinder Institute for Constitutional Democracy. For some years now, we have collaborated with the Kinder Institute in putting on one panel discussion each year during the festival, and we're so grateful to them for their continued partnership. Unbound, as you probably know by now, is all about audience interaction, and we would love you to join in the conversation, just as you would if we were gathering in person. Please feel free to post questions for the panelists in the chat box, and they will get to them towards the end of the session. And to encourage you to participate, we will, as usual, be giving away a copy of Sarah and Walter's most recent books to one randomly selected audience member who asks a question. On which subject, special congratulations this evening to Sarah Kendzior, whose brilliant book, Hiding in Plain Sight, is actually out in paperback today. So we are thrilled to have her with us to celebrate. And it's now my pleasure to welcome this evening's moderator, Dr. Jeff Pasley. I can't think of a better qualified person to moderate this discussion. Jeff is the Associate Director of the Kinder Institute, and he is himself the author of 2 books on the Missouri Bicentennial, this first of which, A Fire Bell in the Past, The Missouri Crisis at 200, will be forthcoming in May. Jeff, welcome to Unbound.
Well, thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me, and thanks for putting this whole thing on. Really appreciate it. Yes. Well, first of all, I should say I'm only the editor of one of those of that book, but it's part of a lot of things that the Kinder Institute's been doing for the Missouri Bicentennial. Missouri Bicentennial is a real tough one. Many of us who've planted ourselves here love the state, even if it doesn't always love us back. And while 200 years is a good run that deserves some recognition, there's no getting around the difficulties of appropriately commemorating what's, the negative event that occurred in 1821, the willful expansion of slavery and white supremacy into the West and the future of the country, all set up by a particularly egregious theft of indigenous lands that, by the way, one of the authors in our book has some previously unknown details about, so check that out. Some might say it's a more appropriate occasion for an apology than a party, so I guess we're kind of doing all of these things. The state's largely ignored it or gone ultra generic, like the license plates many of us have. We historians of the Kinder Institute, we decided to do it the scholarly way with a conference that we actually held in the bicentennial of the anti-slavery amendment, of the Talmadge Amendment that tried to ban slavery from Missouri 2 years ago, and books and an exhibit that tell the story of Missouri and its origins with full slavery and with the warts all exposed. And tonight's panel, I guess, is another installment in that, featuring some decidedly non-celebratory books. But thank you to Walter Johnson and Sarah Kendzior for joining us for that. First up tonight is Walter Johnson, who we're very happy to have here. Walter is the Winthrop Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, and more importantly for our purposes, a 2006 inductee into the Rockbridge High School Hall of Fame. As I suppose many of you know, Walter grew up here in Columbia, where his father taught economics for many years. Perhaps you have walked by or taken a class in the Middlebush Hall Auditorium it's named after. The Walter Johnson who's with us tonight happens to be one of the preeminent living historians of the United States, full stop. His multi-prize winning book, Soul by Soul, Life Inside the Antebellum Slave Market from 1999, reinvented the study of slavery just in time for a new century when America's racial history would necessarily loom larger and larger in our political discourse. Walter really helped set the terms in which historians and the public now discuss the history of slavery, even if they don't always realize who originally set the terms. More Walter and an associated group of historians, probably even than the New York Times. Walter followed it up with the almost as well-received River of Dark Dreams, Slavery and Empire of the Mississippi Valley's Cotton Kingdom, along with many other writings in both scholarly and more popular venues. In more recent years, it seems Walter's turned his thoughts back to his home state, like many people around the world did in the years after the killing of Michael Brown in 2014 and the subsequent protests in Ferguson, and then the follow-on ones here in the MU campus the year after that. His latest book that he'll be talking about tonight is The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the United States, which was published last spring. And we only wish we could have Walter here in person, but let's just welcome Walter to a Columbia-based Zoom in the Unbound Book Festival.
All right, yeah, it is nice to sort of semi-be in Columbia. I do want to thank Jeff, who may not remember, but he was probably the earliest supporter of the book. I think I remember seeing very shortly after the book was first announced, long before it existed, there was a flurry on Twitter about, oh no, another outsider is writing a book about St. Louis, and people from the outside always do us wrong. And I do remember Jeff remembering again my father and sticking up for me. So I appreciate that from way back. And it's nice, like I said, to do an event in Columbia, and one where my father's been so happily remembered. I'm just going to read a tiny little bit from the very beginning of the book to give you a sense of what animates it, and then we can talk more. Of the city's abandoned houses, it is perhaps fair to say that they are worth more dead than alive. The deep burgundy bricks, so smooth they seem almost glazed, molded out of the clay from the pits on the city's south side and fired in the kilns of its famous brickworks around the turn of the century, sell for 50 cents a piece today in cities like New Orleans and Houston. For many years, there was little regulation of the demolition business, and row houses and brownstones containing anywhere between 20,000 and 40,000 bricks were easy money for anyone with a pry bar and a pickup. Even today, when demolition companies must be licensed and teardowns authorized, there are rogue demo men, brick rustlers, who break into abandoned houses to steal the copper wiring, the iron plumbing, and the lead counterweights out of the window frames. Some will set an old house on fire, knowing that the water from the firemen's hoses will soften the mortar, making the bricks easier to salvage and scrape clean for sale. So many of the houses in North St. Louis have been torn down that some of the neighborhoods look like rural farmsteads, clusters of houses here and there surrounded by open space. St. Louis today has the highest murder rate in the nation, around 4 times the rate in Chicago and the 13th highest in the world, and the highest rate of police shootings in the nation. There is an 18-year difference in life expectancy between a child born to a family living in the almost completely black Jeff Vanderloo neighborhood in North St. Louis, and a child born to a family living in the majority white suburb of Clayton, which sits less than 10 miles to the west. Indeed, the significant differences in virtually any marker of social well-being in the city of St. Louis, rates of adult diabetes or childhood asthma, levels of lead in the bloodstream, internet access, all of these can be charted down a single line, Delmar Avenue, which bisects the city between north and south, between black and white. Just over the city line in St. Louis County boasts 3 of the 25 wealthiest suburbs in the United States, Town and Country, Ladue, and Frontenac. Back in the city, standing on streets that, depending on the block, content to leave the nation in the density of accidents involving pedestrians, gun murders, and payday loan stores, it is hard not to wonder, what happened here?
Oh, is that it? Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. 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 So excuse me. I was settling in to listen. Well, then our next up is Sarah Kendzior, who is so thank you to Walter. Apologize for that. Next up is Sarah Kendzior, a truly world-renowned journalist who's pulled off the amazing feat of building that international reputation while based in St. Louis, Missouri. In that sense, she's lived out one of the promises of the internet, that you can do what you do and be relevant from anywhere, while chronicling and sometimes bearing the brunt of its worst side effects on the industry she's worked in, journalism and academia. Her book's partly autobiographical, so I shouldn't spoil that. But suffice to say, she's gone from being a conventional print journalist with the New York Daily News, one of the most conventional news outlets you could imagine, in the sense of being so much like such a 20th century institution, to an academic, to an online journalist in just about every format that they've managed to invent, in venues around the world and across the spectrum, really, of all spectrums, from Politico, The Atlantic, and Foreign Policy, to Al Jazeera English and La Stampa, to Teen Vogue and Mary Claire. And that's just like a couple, just the ones I pulled out of it, just briefly scanning over. I personally first became aware of her work probably through some of her 132,000 tweets, me and about 600,000 other people, covered for the past probably 10 years, the world's slide into ignorance and authoritarianism and the protests against it, often in a long form that I've always appreciated, and the bracingly personal approach of the best internet journalism. As if that weren't enough, Sarah Kendzior, and I suppose since Alex called me doctor, I suppose I should be doing Dr. Walter Johnson and Dr. Sarah Kendzior, as the holder of a PhD in anthropology from Washington University in St. Louis, who I think brought her to St. Louis, has published a great deal of academic work about Central Asian authoritarianism in addition to her journalism. Most recently, besides the book she's talking about tonight, Hiding in Plain Sight, Sarah is the author of a best-selling book of essays, The View from Flyover Country, and the co-host of the podcast Gaslit Nation, perhaps as literally true a hyperbolic title as I've ever heard, covered in the last few years. I believe Sarah also coined, at least I think she coined it, I know she used it, the very apt political description of Missouri that I always liked, that it was a purple state, like a bruise. Anyway, thanks for being with us, Sarah.
Oh, thank you for having me. So should I go ahead and read, Jeff? I'm going to take that as a yes. Okay, so I'm going to follow Walter's lead here and just read a little bit because I know everybody wants to get to questions. This is from my book, Hiding in Plain Sight, which is about America as a whole, but I use Missouri as kind of a microcosm for our national crisis. And the chapter I'm going to read from is called The Bellwether of American Decline. I live in Missouri, a state in the center of America, a state that sits halfway down the Mississippi River and whose northern border parallels the Mason-Dixon line. In the 20th century, Missouri was proclaimed the bellwether state due to the uncanny ability of its residents to vote for the winner of the presidential election. From 1904 to 2008, Missouri voted for the winning presidential candidate in every year except 1956. For over a century, Missouri was where you looked to discover what direction America would go. It's now where to look if you want to know how the country went to hell. To understand the rise of Trump, you need to understand the history of America. To understand the history of America, you need to understand Missouri. You may blanch at this, given Missouri's presumed Midwestern irrelevance, as well as the simplistic descriptions of, quote, red states churned out since the 2016 election. Prior to Trump taking office, the Midwest tended to be ignored by the national press unless there was a tornado, a riot, or another camera-ready disaster. But Trump's win made the heartland intriguing to coastal reporters who dropped into a diverse and complex region with their pre-written narratives, needing only a white man or two to embody the cliches. Midwesterners were transformed into MAGA hat-wearing retired manufacturing workers who sit in diners reciting platitudes about their unshaking loyalty to a New York City tycoon. A media makeover is a peculiar wound. It's a terrible feeling to be in pain and to be ignored, as a place, as a person. It's worse to be given a mask and told it's your face. I'm telling you the story of Missouri because what happened to people here matters in its own right, a radical notion in a media era defined by coastal domination, but also because Missouri is a national litmus test for corruption and injustice. We show how low America can go, and while some of our wounds may be self-inflicted, they are also contagious. We live under the tyranny of the minority on a state level, which is subject to the tyranny of the minority on a national level, which is subject to the tyranny of the elite on an international level. After the 2016 election, a journalist wrote a profile of me called a Cassandra in Trump land. Cassandra was a Greek goddess, cursed to see the future, but never be believed. That article was about my book, The View from Flyover Country, a collection of essays written between 2012 and 2014 that was once viewed as pessimistic, but is now heralded as prescient. I wrote about all of America, but I saw America through Missouri's eyes, which means I saw hell and I saw it in advance. I've concluded that the surreal quality of Missouri life has prompted people to doubt my assertions, even when I'm simply listing the facts. The facts no longer add up. The facts make you wish they were fiction, but that is all the more reason that we need to hear them. Missouri has two nicknames. The first is the Show Me State, which allegedly came from a congressman named Willard Duncan Van Diver, who in 1899, displeased with a blowhard politician's response, proclaimed, "I come from a state that raises corn and cotton and cockleburs and Democrats, and frothy eloquence neither convinces nor satisfies me. I'm from Missouri. You've got to show me." In 21st century Missouri, the cornfields are contaminated with floodwater and the blue dog Democrats have turned into radical Republicans, but the dissatisfaction and demand for proof from Van Diver's era remains. Missourians are locked in a battle against their representatives for accountability in government. In 2018, voters across the political spectrum overwhelmingly passed Clean Missouri, a ballot initiative aimed at ending partisan redistricting, limiting lobbying, and forcing officials to reveal financial records. Today, the very legislators that Clean Missouri targeted are attempting to overturn the initiative in defiance of public will, leaving the Show Me State cloaked in secrecy. So I'll stop there.
Okay, yeah, stop on a particularly ignominious moment. Sarah, you've heard the other story about Show Me?
No, probably not. What is it?
Well, I mean, there's many, but the other one, that's also very appropriate has to do with that it was coined about strikebreakers from Missouri in Leadville, Colorado, who were said to be so ignorant that he's from Missouri, so you had to show it, like how to actually do the work. That's I think I got that from Jared Roll, historian of stories. I mean, he definitely writes about those same strikebreakers, so about the lead miners. Well, thank you for these books, y'all. All right, you know why I said that? You know why I unconsciously went to the second person plural, Southern there is because one of the things I've been thinking about is in the books, and just in the remarks, the term Midwest was thrown around several times. And one of the things I guess that strikes me about, especially from the point of view of, obviously, early American historian and kind of been working on the origin point. And one of the things that struck me is that in its original form, it's kind of in the wrong place, but it's very Southern. in the sense that it's these, and there are Germans, there are others, but it's all these people from Virginia, people who, and the slaves they forced to come, enslaved people they forced to come from, from Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky. And I guess in terms of the modern day definitions of the Midwest that we use, people argue about whether Ohio's the Midwest, or whether Kansas is in the Midwest or Ohio's in the Midwest. But one of the things that strikes me that is always true is there almost never a slave state that term is used about, except for Missouri. As in, we were the only one that anyone calls Midwest that's on the wrong side of the Civil War. So does that, and I guess that brings up the question for me is, does that heritage of slavery have any particular, that Southern heritage have any particular contribution to what Missouri makes Missouri what it is?
I get asked this a lot, and sometimes I just say, well, Missouri is the Midwest and Missouri is the South, because we do have these distinct pronunciations. But one thing I've noticed,
thing, Sarah, by the way, the easy distinction between the Missouri and Missouri.
What?
That's a St. Louis thing. The Missouri, they're making that easy distinct. That one Post-Dispatch columnist used to love to do that.
Oh,
Bill
yeah.
McClellan, right?
The other thing is, though, whenever this is debated among friends in St. Louis about whether St. Louis itself is Southern or is Midwestern, or how you would define it, and most people kind of agree it's a combination of both. But where I've noticed this split is Black people in St. Louis will say much more often that this is a Southern city, that this is a city heavily influenced, by Southern culture, by the legacy of slavery. White people much more inclined to classify it as Midwestern and put it alongside Illinois and Ohio and so forth. I think all of these designations, Missouri really is a combination. And I would say the same thing for Southern Ohio, Southern Illinois. If you go to any parts of those states, you hear accents, you hear, regional distinctions, and to try to divide these things along state lines never quite works out. But, the debate itself, I think, is revealing about the dynamic of Missouri and a kind of denial people have, about its heritage and how that has endured to today.
Especially white people, right?
Yes, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have a stupid answer and then a longer answer, and the stupid answer comes from having grown up in Columbia, and so what I always understood the Midwest to be is those states which had schools that were in the old Big Eight, and that was really my baseline understanding. Yes. I think that it's both Southern and Western, right? It's at the juncture of the Missouri River system and the Mississippi River system. And I think in a way that does produce a particularly toxic intermingling of imperialism and anti-Blackness. And I think what Sarah said is really right and interesting, is that it is more likely African Americans in St. Louis who think about St. Louis as part of the South, and who emphasize, in fact, that there was never any Reconstruction in Missouri, that the peculiar history of Missouri led to a post-war period without a Reconstruction. And so I think that's there. I also, one of the things I try to really write about in the book is the way that the ascendancy of non-slave holding white people in the state of Missouri produced a kind of a particular sort of removalist attitude towards African Americans, towards free people of color, that is, I think, reflected also in the histories of Indiana, of Illinois, of Kansas eventually, and that is in many instances approaches a kind of exterminationist mindset. And so there's something that's really, really, I think, dangerous about that spot.
Well, it's certainly something that showed up, and then you start thinking about it. I mean, and obviously, you guys were both writing about St. Louis more, but if you think about the history of the state larger, it gets even worse. If you think about the role of Western Missouri, and doing things like trying to go into, bring slavery into Kansas, and then the whole thing where they sort of try to erase the black population in the late 19th century, which is so yeah, that's particularly apt there. Of course, the weird thing about Columbia, Walter, is that this is the middle of, they, of course, I don't think the term was really used until civil rights era, really, or maybe or really early 20th century, is that they are aware of the Southern thing out here. I don't know about in the city of Columbia, but since
there was always I think there was a little Dixie Lake.
Yeah, there's a little Dixie Lake, and there's.
Yeah, I mean, it's taken me a long time to. I mean, I don't think I really. I approached this book as a way of trying to understand the place that I was from, and I learned a lot about Missouri and Columbia from writing about St. Louis. But I didn't know until somebody told me, several months ago, that Harlan Bartholomew had also done a plan in Columbia. And I didn't know about the urban redevelopment by bulldozer in Columbia. I didn't know about Sharp's End. And so, even though I grew up living next door to the contractor who was responsible for the project. Right. And so a lot of what has happened, to me, as I've written this book, is I've learned about the kind of historical and social and economic and racial predicates of my own life. But I actually think there's, more that I would be able to learn if I had done more history about, I'm sure people in St. Louis are angry at me now. And, I'm sure people in Columbia will be overjoyed if I said I was planning to write a muckraking book about Columbia next.
Oh, you should. Are you gonna do that?
It's a joke. It's a joke.
Well, I mean, somebody should for sure. I have some of the same experiences, though I kind of did it in the wrong order, but that's all right. I guess both of you wrote these books. I mean, there's kind of. Obviously, Sarah's a journalist, so it's kind of about the present. Walter had clearly had some present day, or what was present day when he started it, some things in mind. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what the sort of immediate inspirations were, and then both of you sort of update it because events keep moving. I imagine Walter must have finished yours probably late 2019 or something, and I don't know when Sarah would have finished hers.
September 2019.
Right. So, Phyllis, how does 2020 and 2021 fit into what you guys laid out in these books?
I mean, my book it's like a combination of three things. It was a chronicle of Donald Trump's life, his entry into public life, and his history of criminality and his relationships with various mafia networks, particularly the Russian mafia. Then it was also the story of America's decline through the same period. This is, basically the late 70s to the present, the widespread economic inequality, the collapse of social trust, the collapse of institutions, widespread corruption, bringing us to Trump, presenting Trump as what he was, not a fluke, but a culmination in many, many ways, a product of a broken American culture, but also someone who is very adept at exploiting that culture. And there is, as you mentioned, somewhat of an autobiographical component to the book, because this is my entire life. This is all I know. I'm a child of the Reagan era. And so I got to grow up, with Trump looming large as this sort of shady, evil figure, that was always going bankrupt or getting divorced or shaking people down, yet kept climbing to the top, being remade over and over through reality TV with the help of, people in politics, and preying on regions like this one, along with people like Carl Icahn and others, from New York. And of course, you see people like Josh Hawley trying to twist all this, trying to make himself seem like the great savior of Missouri, where he's actually embedded with this exact crowd of people. So I hope folks grasp that. But anyway, so I wrote this book. Everybody's like, oh my God, this is the most dire, pessimistic, apocalyptic book. And then everything in it bore out. It all came true. I was writing it during the Mueller probe with great frustration with the Mueller probe because I didn't think it was going to amount to anything. I thought Trump was going to cause a mass death event, which he did the next year. I thought there'd be prohibitions on travel to the point that the epilogue is written in the past tense, referring to a time where we were able to roam freely. And my editor is like, "What's up with that?" I'm like, "Oh, you wait and see. QAnon's in it. I mean, the whole gang is in it." It is a depressing book, and we're living in a depressing aftermath of the Trump administration, and also on a state level in Missouri, of course, we're seeing the exact same trends. I'll wrap this up real quick by saying, of course, I wrote about Eric Greitens as an example of this endemic corruption, elite criminal impunity, refusal to enforce accountability. And now here he is, having been indicted twice, ready to relaunch his Senate campaign, partnered with Donald Trump Jr.'s corrupt girlfriend. And so you just see the same cycle perpetuating itself again and again and again. And that's not even to go into all the other things I wrote about Ferguson, racism. And we could talk about maybe that today because of the verdict today. But I'll give Walter a chance to talk.
No, I really liked what the piece that you read of the book, which I like, Sarah, and also what you just said, is that I think about the history of St. Louis and really the history of Missouri as prefigurative. Mm-hmm. As demonstrating or suggesting what is going to happen. And so I think of that Ferguson as prefigurative, and what happened at Mizzou in 2015 as prefigurative, and of coming out of all of that kind of extraordinary combination of cynical plutocracy and white supremacy and just sometimes just plain xenophobic ignorance that we know, but also out of the long radical tradition in Missouri, whether that's the history of communism in Missouri or the history of black radicalism in Missouri. And I think that that's also what we saw in Ferguson and saw at Mizzou. And so the state of Missouri has just been wide open particularly if you think about St. Louis as far as political conflict since 2014, right? I mean, you had another uprising in 2017 that was really a prefigurative uprising of what happened all over the United States last summer. It was the Jason Stockley uprising about police impunity. Right. And it was, again, an occasion for the very sorts of impunity that were being protested. But those people in St. Louis, and I can't say that I'm one of them, but I think that Sarah has been, have held that window of possibility open since 2014. Right. There has been a radical movement in St. Louis since 2014 that persists to this day, that makes it possible to imagine a different kind of future. And so I see those two things as coming through, to the fact that Josh Hawley and Cori Bush emerged on the national stage out of Missouri at the very same moment, or that the fact that Cori Bush was literally on the sidewalk in front of the McCloskey's house this summer. I do see it as deeply framing and suggesting to us what's going to happen. And I think that if I look at St. Louis, there are some reasons for optimism. Now, the other thing that I see is that a lot of what we have concerned ourselves with as politics, the whole crazy Trump, the sideshow has distracted us in so many ways from the underlying inequality, from the what Sarah's talking about the history from the 70s on, or from the 50s on, or from the 30s on, that just goes on unabated, just grinds on in St. Louis and in the rest of Missouri as well.
It's one of the things that Sarah talked about that I could relate to is the sense of, and I don't know what what explains it, the sense of, and the connection of Donald Trump and Carl Icahn resonates with me in the sense of like what it is that's so late, and how does it where they seem to be so open to predation from the outside and kind of not knowing what hits them and kind of not valuing what they, I don't know. I mean, sometimes it feels like not valuing what they have. Sometimes it feels like being in cahoots with these forces. What is it that makes, I mean, that's the, the distinctive history. I actually have been teaching the Missouri history class in recent years. And I have this like one graphic I have of all the companies that have been ripped, all the St. Louis companies have disappeared, and it like gets longer and longer, and it's all the same. It's always the same story of somebody. It's not always quite as vicious as Carl Icahn, but it's always some similar thing of somebody who looks pretty good from outside comes in and gives someone money, and it's all torn apart. And Trump, feels like a similar thing where they don't know. And Sarah, you'd mentioned living, I also kind of lived on the East Coast for a few years and kind of knew what Trump was. And it just seemed like people here kind of didn't or something. And what is it that leaves this place open to these things?
Yeah, I mean,
I open to everything.
What leaves us open to it is bad representation and people not standing up for those who are being hurt. I get emails and tweets and stuff all the time about TWA, even though, Icahn destroyed that so long ago. Like, that pain endures. And if anything does hold the state together, I think it's a collective feeling of abandonment, for different reasons, for different populations. But everybody feels abandoned. Everybody feels betrayed. That plays into a sense of paranoia. I do think that folks in Missouri did not know the full extent of Trump's criminal history, but I would say that's true of quite a lot of the country, in part because the mainstream media in 2015 and 2016 was not educating the public about this. They were burying his financial criminal history. They were burying his ties, his illicit ties to the Russian mafia, to the Kremlin, to Saudi Arabia, to all of these, nefarious actors around the world. And they were putting on a show. And this was kind of an extension of his persona from The Apprentice, which when I would talk to people voting for Trump, a lot of people really believed in that persona. They really thought this was like a very successful businessman who cared about them, who cared about people in Missouri who lost their jobs. Trump was playing all the right cards. He was talking about building infrastructure, bringing jobs back here, restoring dignity. And of course, he was incredibly xenophobic and racist, which appealed to quite a lot of people in this state. But he knew what to say to make people feel good. And they bought into that Apprentice image. And I don't think that that's a sign of stupidity, because I think people assumed, if this guy is really a career criminal, surely someone is going to say something, and not just the media. Like, surely the FBI would say something, the CIA would say something, the Obama administration would say something. The only person who was really saying anything in blunt terms was Hillary Clinton, who of course they didn't trust because, she's the opposing candidate, but also she's Hillary Clinton. And, a lot of people had issues with her. And so that just led to a really disastrous situation. And then I think in terms of other sort of, corporate raiders, these kind of predators that come in, this is happening all over the country. I think it's particularly pernicious here. And one thing I do resent is that I hear often like, well, you deserve it. Like, your state voted Republican, your state voted red, people there deserve it. They got what they voted for, completely ignoring gerrymandering and voter suppression. Wow. And the fact that when it comes down to ballot initiatives, people do vote in a more progressive way to get rid of dark money, to raise the minimum wage, to protect labor unions, all these things. And I just don't think anybody deserves to suffer. I don't care who you voted for. I don't think anybody deserved the suffering that the Trump administration caused or that any of these Wall Street raiders caused.
Yeah, it's very hard to convey, and I still try to convey, and I really believe in the sense that one has as a Missourian of being perpetually misunderstood and abandoned by, those in Washington or New York, and at the same time, the sense of disappointment and responsibility one feels, right? And I do think though that Sarah's word abandonment is an enormously important word, because abandonment describes the north side of St. Louis, right? But abandonment also describes rural Missouri.
It does.
And it describes the disinvestment in education. It describes the sadism of the healthcare system. It describes the vulnerability to addiction. It describes violence at the hands of the police, and it describes over-incarceration. And we have been for, one could argue, the entirety of American history separated by people like Trump, by plutocrats who wield difference as a way of making it impossible for those who live in different parts of the country or have different sorts of jobs or are of different, races or immigrant categories or gender categories to find common cause. But that word abandonment is in a way, that's the key to helping people understand that. Now, that's a fool's errand. We know that, right? People have been trying that from Reconstruction on, certainly better people than I. But that, as a Missourian, I agree with Sarah in the sense that I'm not just going to say, well, we need to forget about this project, because that's the project that I feel like saved me. And so I want to try to pass that on to people.
Agreed. Well, so we're starting to have audience questions, and I'm not exactly sure what's when I do this academically, I always go in the exact order they're asked, so I don't have to hear about it. But I think these are kind of groupable. So why don't we start with the I guess why don't we start with the topical one, which is, and I'll add one that I had to it, which is that one of the things that I find that trying to get over the sense of intellectual abandonment that one has and combat it, you try to find things that are important even if they're bad. In Missouri, right? That's a very Missouri, to me, that's a very Missouri thing. It's like, no, look, we're terrible in this.
This happened here.
It was happened here. It's awful, but it happened.
I know, man.
Right? I'm sure Walter has that same. I have a long list of those things. But so I guess one of the things that's been striking me though is that in some ways this Black Lives Matter or something, or this recent round of protests started here. It didn't literally start, but it did become famous here. And of course, there was the phenomenon that Sarah talks about of Missouri. Bad things happen in Missouri and it becomes big. Was well known for something bad happening in Missouri because that easily sticks to us. But I guess what does it mean that then it's gotten actually somewhat even bigger in such different places? Minneapolis and St. Louis may share a river, but otherwise not that much. And if you talk about the history of the different, there's some policies that are similar, but a lot of policies that are extremely different. So what does it mean that those things, in some ways the epicenter of some of these conflict of these protests and conflicts moved north the way it did, and then the audience member in Winnegar Peckinpah asks, what does the conviction today, can that be any kind of a catalyst for change?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with Ferguson. I covered Ferguson in real time because I live here. And one thing I do want to say is that the uprising that happened in Ferguson happened because Black people in the metro St. Louis area were deeply frustrated, with decades on end of police brutality. And what unfortunately happened after that was, of course, no real meaningful reform in the region, despite those efforts, despite the incredible suffering that people endured while protesting, and also a narrative hijacking of the movement, and this is controversial, but, there isn't a Black Lives Matter chapter here. And a lot of Ferguson activists don't want to identify with that because so many people came in from out of town and, again, exploited this region. This happens all the time, and made money off of suffering and pain. That said, the problems that were being taken on here, the principle of Black Lives Matter is something that applies nationally. And so, of course, you see police brutality nationally. You see white officers preying on Black Americans, shooting them with impunity nationally. And so it wasn't a surprise that happened today, that happened in, Minnesota. What was a surprise, at least to me, was the verdict today. And I'm obviously relieved that Chauvin is guilty on 3 counts. I was watching it come in with my daughter, who's 13. I was 13 during the Rodney King trial and the LA riots. And I was just, feeling sick and bracing myself for it. That said, I'm glad that people like Keith Ellison are making a distinction between accountability, which is what we did see today, and justice, which we haven't seen, because it's a systemic problem. And it's a problem that it encompasses our entire country. I do think that St. Louis is an epicenter of it. And I do think, as Walter was pointing out, a lot of big political movements emerged from here across the political spectrum. The Ferguson movement through the Tea Party, every kind of politics. But, I don't know whether this really heralds a turning of the tide, but it's good to have a precedent of an officer facing serious consequences, because we've previously had a precedent of impunity, and that's a very dangerous precedent. So I'm glad at least that occurred.
Yeah, I feel like people in St. Louis, the people who Sarah covered and also who Sarah continued to cover, and those of you who have not read her articles about Darren Seals, I really suggest that you do read those, and that you understand the tensions between the grassroots movement in St. Louis and the way that it became national, and the way that some of the radical edge that existed in St. Louis, and some of the inclusion of all kinds of people, of gang members and different kinds of dissidents that happened in St. Louis was lost. I think that's a really important thing to recognize. And I do think that people in St. Louis, for whatever, almost a year, through extraordinary courage and organization, held that door open. And so I don't have the sense so much that the movement has left St. Louis as just that St. Louis helped to open the door for things nationally. Now, I have to admit that I'm, it's not going to surprise anybody who's read my book. I'm a cynic. And so I think that what happened was that the Minneapolis Police Department decided that Derek Chauvin was going to take one for the team. And that by defining what he did as unacceptable, the baseline police violence in the society, the military occupation of so many of our cities, the over-policing of interzones where black and white meet was normalized. And I have a even further darker vision, which is that police shootings, as terrible as they are a symptom of the deeper inequality in the society, right? You could reform the police the way that the reformers want to do, but unless you address the inequality in the society, it's going to keep happening. It's a problem that is much deeper than just the police. And so for me, it would have been obscene had he been acquitted. We have all been taught, many of us from birth, it has taken some others like me to, a little while to learn that the United States continually produces that sort of obscenity. I'm glad we didn't have to see that today.
Very wow, great answer. So we have some thorny questions here. So I guess Walter, since this somebody's, I know that they're trying to challenge your cynicism. But Carol Smith asks, what are the one or two changes do you hope your books bring about? It's an optimistic
man,
Columbia question.
I mean, I have a kind of a peculiar relationship to that question, which I think is a great question. I have learned so much from the city of St. Louis and from activists in the city of St. Louis that I honestly, in terms of that question, I don't really position myself or understand myself to be a visionary so much as I want to just amplify things that are happening in St. Louis. And so I think that what I see when I look at St. Louis, and I try to write about this in the epilogue, is all kinds of self-directed mutual aid projects in the north side of St. Louis, people taking care of one another and building up their collective capacity in spite of the municipal abandonment. And that brings me more hope than I can describe. That has made me feel like a more optimistic person to see the human flourishing amidst the social and legal abandonment that I see everywhere in St. Louis. Now, that said, there are, the Close the Workhouse campaign brings me joy. Or at least optimism. Action St. Louis, Arch City Defenders, and I think that it is possible to imagine that the election of Cori Bush and the election of Tashara Jones as mayor of St. Louis are actually real milestones in the history of the transformation of at least St. Louis and hopefully Missouri and possibly the United States. I guess they say I'm an optimist of the will, but a pessimist of the intellect. And so I want to believe.
Well, it's very Missouri. I mean, one of the things I feel like I've learned living here as long as I have, kind of unintentionally, is you have to do it yourself. You have to make your own change, and don't really expect.
Well, I mean, people
don't really expect anything above you too.
I've heard countless people in North St. Louis, most notably Sylvester Brown, say, look, we've been waiting 400 years for some kind of justice or some kind of help to come, and we can't wait any longer. We just need to set about doing this, set about making this better. And that to me is that's a very instructive moment.
Sarah, what do you think? Do you have one or two changes you hope your book makes?
I think I'm in line with both of you, and having an attitude that's often seen as cynicism or pessimism, but is honestly realism, in the hope that if you expose the problem, if you acknowledge that the problems exist, if you acknowledge their severity, that's the first step to solving them. Not looking for a savior from above, because it's never going to happen, not expecting things to run functionally, but figuring out creative ways around them. And so, in this book, it was a kind of a pain to write. I felt like I was filling in for Mueller. I felt like I was filling in for Congress. I was like, where are our agents of accountability for this very blatant criminality? And I also, one thing I don't like, and I hope that this changes, is that I am one of few people, living in this part of the country that has a national, very large platform. And there's no reason for that. There's no reason that other authors who are, situated in the Midwest or the South are not, on television, not writing for, quote, like big places, having book deals and whatnot. Like, there's no reason that Missouri is not representative of the United States, but for some reason, New York City or DC is thought to be. Like, that's ridiculous. And so, I try to bring that approach in there. And so I hope that, I guess, like, at least I'm an example of the fact that this can work, that people will listen to folks from this region if they have something good to say. And I think that, people like Cori or Tashara winning, is another example of that, where you see them losing the first election, rising up, continuing on, being very resolute. This is a resolute state, because we deal with so much, try not to swear, so many bad things. And so, because of that, I think people are tougher and stronger. And so that's, I guess, a takeaway, of what I hope to see more of.
Well, it's a literary festival. I hope you can swear. I don't know.
Well, I was gonna say bullshit. I don't know whether that falls into the swear line.
That would be very limited. Well, so we have a couple of questions that are kind of asking us to get out of St. Louis. Alex says it's totally fine to swear. Okay, well, you know what? That makes me just I should, but then now I'm
You
frozen.
notice he didn't write that when you said y'all, though, right?
He didn't.
You're allowed to swear, but we haven't got a judgment on the y'all.
Y'all. That's just it. That's the second person plural of that's somehow I picked up in Kansas. I don't know. So we have a couple people asking us to get out of St. Louis. So we have people asking us to compare St. Louis to other cities. Well, two things. One person asking us, Barbara S., asking us to compare St. Louis to similar cities. She mentions Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, which have the combination of immigrant neighborhoods and African-American ones. And I throw in Baltimore. Baltimore is the more St. Louis-like place to me, down to the bricks and the people stealing the bricks that Walter mentioned in his thing. So compare and contrast St. Louis to those places, and then we have somebody asking us about Kansas City within Missouri, which that's one of the Missouri's problems, is that it's so balkanized between the different regions, that having done both, I can just tell you the St. Louis people and the Kansas City people, they may be allied on something, they just have no idea what the other is doing ever, nor do they care. Which could stand to change some days. But we'll do some comparison and contrast. Authors.
Baltimore, man, I agree. I mean, Baltimore, you got a hard division between the city and the county, emerged at roughly the same time. You have a large medically focused nonprofit sector that you have a lot of professionals who live outside the city, but that actually doesn't help your tax base. I think that city does remind me a lot of St. Louis. I go to Cleveland. Cleveland reminds me a lot of St. Louis. It reminds me of St. Louis because of capital flight and municipal abandonment, as well as the bricks and the extraordinary architecture. And I think that the question is right in the sense that if you think about capital flight, then Pittsburgh, Cincinnati. I mean, Pittsburgh, I think, is at this point quite a bit more successful in many ways at having addressed that than St. Louis is. But I do. I come back to that. And I don't know exactly why. There is no place on earth that I feel as hopeful when I am there as St. Louis. I mean, George Lipsitz, who's, a hero of mine and a mentor, talks about St. Louis as being the right place for the wrong reasons. And I really do think that there's a possibility there of doing things that haven't been done or can't be done elsewhere. My brother lives in Kansas City, and I feel like I should have a better answer about Kansas City. I honestly, just to be completely forthright about it, I honestly just haven't done the work to understand Kansas City that well. I will say that I am actually not planning to write a muckraking history of Columbia, Missouri, but I'm trying to write a book about John Brown, and so I'm planning to learn about Kansas City. And it does seem to me, one thing I will say is that there were extraordinary. There's all the things that are happening in Kansas in the 1850s, right? And we need to think about the fact that two different settler colonial powers are fighting out a war about their future in Indian territory. We need to emphasize all that. There are around the Kansas City metro these extraordinary small histories of alliances between Native Americans and anti-slavery activists that I'm also very, very interested in the 1850s.
And along with some of the most ferociously pro-slavery people in the whole state.
The
answer to the person's question is not a very good one, which is that if you want to look at Civil War, St. Louis is looking pretty good.
Yeah, right.
St. Louis is like the great force for the great anti-slavery force to a degree, and Kansas City is the bad one, because they've for whatever reason. Sarah, do you have any compare and contrast thoughts?
I mean, I agree with everything said about the comparisons between St. Louis and Baltimore, Cleveland. You know, I agree with Pittsburgh being more like on the up and up. As to the question about, you know, how do the different regions of Missouri kind of meld together or work together? I mean, that's something I think everyone's struggling with, especially going into, you know, Senate elections and so forth. Unfortunately, my answer there is, again, that we're held together by abandonment. And, you know, we do see points of agreement when we do have ballot initiatives. You know, we see certain things like labor protection being voted on unanimously in a large margin, including by Republicans. And again, you know, I'm just reiterating points of this conversation. The divide is racial. It's between black and white, but also between, you know, people who aren't black, who support black rights, and between racists and anti-racists. And I don't know how to get past that divide when it's so rigorously exploited by our elected officials, by, you know, Fox News, by, you know, just so many people. And there still is reluctance, I think, among most white people, not just in Missouri, but nationwide, to admit the extent of the problem, to admit the, you know, systemic nature of it, and to, you know, not make it about themselves, but to try to have, you know, empathy for people who are being systematically discriminated against and have been, you know, for centuries on end. I don't know how to get to that point, especially post-pandemic, when I think psychologically everyone is feeling battered and beaten down. And it's like our capacity for empathy seems like it's tapped out, which is a very tragic thing. It's like the worst time that that could happen when you see all of these, you know, white supremacist militant groups on the rise. And so I'm worried about our future. You know, I feel that same feeling of hope in St. Louis, of possibility, because I think there's a sort of clear-eyed vision that tends to emanate from here. How it plays out, though, in practice, you know, that's the problem, because I could see a lot of, you know, unfortunately, I see violence coming down the road in the years to come.
Yeah. The sense of mutual abandonment that you talked about is not a very difficult thing to work out, you know, or I know mutual, everyone thinks they've been abandoned.
Well, I think people view it as zero sum. That's the problem. Instead of seeing it as like we have collectively been abandoned, and in many ways share that same thing, you know, stagnant wages, joblessness, addiction, you know, and so forth. It's this like, if you get something, then I don't. And that's nationwide, but I think it's very pronounced here, and it tends to express itself through racist tropes.
Well, so I think we're about out of time. Walter's kind of already talked about what he's going to do next. Which John Brown, Sarah, what are you looking at next for? I
just finished writing a graphic novel with my partner from Gaslit Nation, Andrea Chalupa, about dictatorship, and I'm working on another book. I'm gonna say no more about that. Look for the graphic novel, I think, next year.
All right, Chris, sounds wonderful. Well, thank you all for. I don't know if we gave anyone any hope. But well, you guys were fairly hopeful in St. Louis, and I hope on a
Missouri level we were like super hopeful.
Oh yeah, exactly. Well, right, but it's a level that, but you know, I'd say that's one of the things I've always appreciated about Missouri is about my level of hopefulness.
Yeah, exactly. The rest of the country's like,
Yeah, exactly. If it's too optimistic, it's like Minnesota. Oh my gosh, come on. But thank you guys very much. And Alex is back.
I'm back. Thank you for an amazing, if sobering, discussion. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm going to walk away, Sarah, with what you said about this state being a resolute state. I'm going to take that away and bank it, because I certainly hope that you're right. But it was a wonderful and a very, very interesting discussion. So thank you all so much for that. Again, our thanks to the Kinder Institute for Constitutional Democracy for their support in putting this particular panel together. Barbara S., I don't know quite what your last name is, but you are the winner of Sarah and Walter's books. So congratulations. If you would please shoot us an email at mail@unboundbookfestival.com, and then we will get those books to you. Finally, just as we wrap up, I probably don't need to remind you that Friday night is the final night somehow of this year's festival. It's our keynote event with 2 Pulitzer Prize winners, Tracy K. Smith and Jericho Brown. It's going to be absolutely amazing. 7 o'clock Central Standard Time. go to the website. You can follow the links from there. We would love to see you there to see what's been a wonderful year off in true style. Sarah, Walter, Jeff, thank you again. Thank you all for being with us. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.